Good morning. How are you? Lovely. It's Friday. We're happy and we're excited about this topic. I'm delighted to be part of this conversation. Let me set the scene for you so that, because I'm going to have you participate, take part, some informal surveys. So the question is, will tech companies be more powerful than governments? Some people would say that's not a question. That's no longer a question. The first thing I'm going to ask you, please raise your hand if this is a topic that concerns you. Please? Oh, not so many people think that are concerned. That's interesting. It's something that excites you. Oh, you see? Exactly. OK, so we're going to talk about that. And setting the scene, but you know this already, tech giants are amassing unprecedented wealth and influence. Their power is increasingly and rivaling traditional states. So we're talking about the traditional state and some of the companies, even Mark Zuckerberg, you must remember when he said, they're not like a company or a corporation. They should be treated more like governments. So we're already talking about that. We know their market cap is exceeding $3 trillion. So what we want to find out through our lovely panel is how do we balance that? We should be worried. What should we be doing? So right now it's a call to action. Let me start with you, Dan. Are you worried and you're not worried? How should we frame this debate that's not new? It's been going on for years. But probably since January 20, more people are talking again about it.
Well, I think it's a little bit of a complex question, and I think it's actually evolving rapidly as well. I think clearly tech companies are becoming more powerful over time. I think many governments are becoming less agile and ability to react in a very fast-moving environment. But I think, as I think about it, I think for now, governments have more power than tech companies do. They've got regulatory authority. They can tax. They can legislate. They can impose penalties on tech companies, whether they be fines, up to antitrust, breaking them up as well. And they have the ability to enforce that. They have the ability to force that through judicial, through law enforcement, through military. And theoretically, governments have moral authority. They were elected by their citizens, and so really their ultimate goal is towards the public good and not towards profits. On the other hand, you look at tech companies, and they're massively powerful. They have huge economic influence. Every bit of our infrastructure relies on tech companies, whether it be, low Earth orbit satellites. I think like 54% of them are controlled by Starlink right now. Whether it be critical internet infrastructure, wireless infrastructure, the tech companies control that infrastructure. They also basically control the megaphones of society today. Like, we do not get our information anymore from basically linear TV or radio. It is done through social media.
Yes.
And those who control X, Meta, TikTok actually have the microphone that can influence how we view information. That information is controlled by algorithms.
Yes.
Those algorithms are opaque, and tech companies can define what stories you see up front, what can be deprioritized, and that can affect the way we think about our society, and they can affect elections as well. And because people use them all the time, they can threaten to withdraw services, and governments have a difficult time when a Facebook or a Meta says, I'm going to withdraw that service if that regulation is passed. And so I think what you have right now is a very symbiotic relationship between the two. They actually count on each other. But I would say, like if I look out, 10, 15 years from now, I see tech companies becoming more and more powerful, and we'll have to see what governments do as a result of that.
And it's important to see what we're going to do, because we're talking about geopolitical actors already. We already have, episodes with big tech companies talking to governments, challenging governments in Brazil, for example. Tony, you led investments in companies that focus on energy, and also you previously were the MD and head of technology investment banking at Morgan Stanley. Do you agree with Dan? What's your perception?
Well, I would never disagree with Dan Schulman, so let's start with that premise. But no, look, I mean, I think Dan framed it well. I think that, this is an evolving dynamic.
Yes.
I think, if we look back over the last 2 decades, there were times when, the large tech companies sort of appeared to have, sort of growing influence, and that was pulled back. And so I think this is a pretty dynamic environment that we live in. I think both are kind of critically important. I think that, what we're seeing, we heard a little bit of this over the last couple of weeks, that with in the U.S., the new administration, I think there'll be more collaboration, between both the government and large tech companies, which I think is a acknowledgement of the role that these large tech companies play in the global economy, and certainly the power and influence that they have in the U.S. economy, both in terms of economic growth as well as sort of core infrastructure. And frankly, capital. I mean, I think you can't, look, you've got 4 companies this year that are going to deploy $400 billion of CapEx to continue to innovate and ensure that we've got the right infrastructure for a lot of the services that Dan alluded to. I think the other countervailing point that I would make that I think complements what Dan said is the other critical thing that the governments can play a role in is ensuring that you've got the spirit and ecosystem of innovation alive and well. I think we've seen that, across emerging economies. I think the Kingdom has done an incredible job of that, and I think the U.S. obviously has been a leader in that. So I think what someone like myself that lives in the world of startups and innovation really cares about is a recognition that, like a lot of these large companies we're talking about today, were startups, 10, 20, 30 years ago. And so what's really important also is that the conditions for entrepreneurship and innovation, are maintained. I think the governments have a role in that. I think they have a role in that in terms of, constructive regulatory policy. I think, the capital markets have a role in that, which is regulated, in ensuring that risk capital, can continue to flourish, and that, from a societal perspective, that the risk-seeking opportunities that, like, our young entrepreneurs want to lean into, that there's a good commercial reward system for that. So I think as long as that happens, I think we're going to be okay. And I think the symbiotic dynamic that Dan alluded to will continue to coexist.
And it'd be interesting from you both to hear a little bit about, is there a ceiling for the new startups in terms of, competition, which is something that it's also been discussed in terms of, the ceiling is set up by these big companies. Let's talk about your experience, government, internationally. Let me start with you, Vittorio. You should know, Vittorio was also a contributor to Mario Draghi's report on the future of European competitiveness, a hugely important report. And I'm talking about this because probably there should be a reflection on the government's role in the past years for this scenario to have to be how it is right now. Powerful tech companies, citizens maybe not so happy with their governments, and probably the lack of investment that is an acute problem in Europe. Is there a mea culpa from governments for what has not happened in the past years that were here? What do you think, Vittorio?
First of all, which one should I use? This one? I don't know. Okay, probably
there
this
you go.
one. Okay,
yes.
This doesn't work.
Thank you.
Technology. Of course, there is some mea culpa, especially in Europe. What I think in the Draghi report we have clearly highlighted is that Europe needs completely to change. And I'm talking specifically about technology. Forget about the political governance, the majority voting.
Yes.
That thing is not my stuff. Of course, there is a change, and of course, there is a strong need for more investment. But I really think that there is a crucial point that both Dan and Tony have touched, which is this. On one hand, we need the big companies to make these big investments to accelerate the digital transition, to create infrastructure, to create the platforms, to create this massive movement for other industries, other sectors to digitize and modernize. On the other hand, and this is the core of the issue here, we need to be sure that the great entrepreneurs, the ones that Tony backs, the 240 entrepreneurs of General Atlantic growth, they can continue to grow their product, their services, without at some point, inadvertently or by decision, being quashed by these mega giants who just can do a product extension or a small entry into a little segment and then de facto kill the opportunity for those entrepreneurs. And I'm on several boards for General Atlantic.
Yes.
The discussion is always, we want distribution through them, are they going to kill us? We want to partner with them, yes, but they only need to bundle something. And if you look at the report, the Draghi report, we have been fairly critical of GDPR, privacy, AI Act in some aspects, and I don't
then
want
you
to...
say so,
we were
Carme.
in two different governments at the same time. So.
Yes.
But on the other hand, we have not been critical of Digital Market Act, especially in the parts where it says either economic dominance or bundling or product extensions should be carefully watched by the regulators. Otherwise, the wonderful companies that we all back will have troubles at some point in their life. And this is what we try to distinguish, which is why I understand the criticism on some of the implications of AI Act and GDPR, but I don't understand the criticism on the market-related regulation, because that is exactly what both Dan and Tony were talking about. Protecting innovation, protecting the guys General Atlantic and many other great firms are trying to make into the next 10 years companies.
But getting into an agreement seems to be the first hurdle that has not been able to be overcome in Europe. So how do you, and let's not talk about politics, but let's talk about getting into an agreement in a room of, let's say, 26 people having to agree on how to look at it.
I'm sorry, I know this is not off the records, but we wrote it so we can say it. Let's face it, we have 240 regulators across Europe. You don't need 240. It's enough to have 10 in Brussels. But these are, you know, very, very entrenched local positions and cars, offices, roles that are very hard to dismantle. I think that I was telling you before that we have said for 6 months that the Draghi report is so great. Now we should say that also the implications of the Draghi report are great, and this is the hard test, because the implications of the actions will be the real test for Europe.
Of course. Carme, you've been already challenged about, I'm sorry, about your role as a co-chair at the UN AI Advisory Body, and you've also worked for the Spanish government as well. You're an entrepreneur, so how are you seeing things first, getting into an agreement and understanding the moment that we're living in terms of this evolution?
Yeah, first of all, I would like to say that the introductions before state that the technology shifts the balance of power. Not only between countries who own, for example, strategic raw materials like rare earths or unique capabilities like chips production,
yes,
but also between new players which are not countries and have the same or more powerful players of the big tech, for example. And that makes us rethink what is the real role of governments. And I think governments must all intervene. I mean, first of all, we cannot expect that the companies act as NGOs. They need to maximize their private profit. So, of course, we expect that they behave ethically, and that's where I think the governments have a role. When the governments have a role when there is a micro failure, the governments have a role to build trust for consumers, trust for citizens, to avoid monopolistic practices, and I think when regulation has a role here in the tech sphere. So, but sometimes people mix, and I think talking about regulations in the US is something not very popular, but I think people misunderstand three concepts that are very well interrelated, but are different. Ethics, governance, and regulation. I have found nobody in this room or any other room that do not agree that we must develop AI in an ethical way. Development and use, prevent unintended or intended misuse of AI by bad players, protect us from the safety or the national security point of view. But the point here is not ethics, because ethical guidelines are subjective, depends on country to country, because they have different principles or values, or depend on the CEO of the company. What we must ensure is governance. What are the systems that are in place? What are the instruments we put in place to ensure that both companies and governments behave ethically? And regulation is one of these tools, but not the only one.
No.
We can achieve the same results, for example, with market incentives, with transparency, with oversight, with monitoring. And that was really exactly the role that we proposed from the UN. We are not pretending that the UN becomes the over-regulator body in the world. There will be different geographical regulations because each market wants to organize in a different way. And the problem of Europe has been that we are not a country. We are 27 different countries. And the competitiveness problem of Europe doesn't come from regulation, it comes from regulative fragmentation. However, the AI Act, that I was a leading negotiator, so I'm the one to blame, it's just one act that applies to 27 countries at once. So that's a way to solve it. While, for example, in the US now you have 150 different laws affecting AI, in different states and different verticals. So last word is...
150?
Yes.
Oh.
So you say that you are not regulated. You are very much regulated too. But you don't have an overall, I would say, federal law that this is why it's so difficult to comply, why legitimately the business don't want to comply. But in this particular case, the EU AI Act does not regulate AI. That's another misunderstanding. We only regulate the high-risk use cases of AI, which is where this affects security, safety, or fundamental rights in specific domains. And why I'm serious about this? Because the only way all these guys can, and you can have your huge investment with a high level of return is if these technologies are adopted massively, mainstream, in all vertical sectors. And that can only happen if we build trust. Trust for consumers and trust for citizens.
Dan, Tony?
Well, I don't disagree with anything that Carme said. I would just say that there's a tension in the system. And the tension in the system is there's a race going on. This is company versus company and country versus country. And when I said that there's a symbiotic relationship between government and big tech companies, it's because there's this race happening. And well, probably most, I won't say every, but most companies developing AI would agree with a lot of what you said. We need to be sure that the worst of it isn't unleashed. But it is moving incredibly rapidly right now. I would bet that we will reach, ASI, artificial superior intelligence, in the next 2 to 3 years. And that is going to be very difficult for regulators and governments to keep up with, while at the same time they want that speed, right? Because if your country falls behind on AI, you fall behind on military capabilities, you fall behind on economic opportunity, you could be subject to misinformation campaigns from somebody else. And so being at the leading edge of some of these technologies, whether it be AI, whether it be quantum, is extraordinarily important for governments and countries. And so making sure that the speed of technological change, which is exponential right now, it is exponential, that the regulators can keep up with it, that is the pressing challenge. I don't think there's a huge disconnect in philosophy as much as there is in the speed of change.
Tony,
yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think, as Dan said, whether you agree with the word race or not, like there is a palpable sense of urgency that the sovereigns are having today, that various industries are having, certainly the innovators, the young companies, which, by the way, are not only creating, these startups are not only creating the next generation of, world-class technology and products, but they're also putting a lot of competitive pressure into the system for the larger incumbents to stay relevant and drive innovation and take advantage of their advantages, which is scale, capital. They have a pretty big, customer base. And so that's that's key. At the same time, I think the other thing that I think is really important to consider here is, you know, the broad-based impact that technology is having today, and as Dan is alluding to with AI, which is a pretty, you know, in some cases, you know, broadly used or overused term, its impact on fundamental industries like energy, financial services, healthcare, right? You know, we're one of the largest investors around. Like that also, you know, like levels up the level of importance today of getting this right. It's critically important, you know, for countries and economies to really enable that, because I think the large industries that are not necessarily technology leaders but laggards really need to sort of start to, you know, continue to adopt innovation. And I think the opportunities are extraordinary. Like what's going to happen for the economic growth, you know, the growth around society, and sort of improvements that we're going to see, the impact on the labor forces across, you know, energy, financial services, healthcare, you know, go across the core industries of the U.S. and globally. That's the power of what we're going to see. And I think it's important that governments, you know, as well as sort of private industries, you know, are allowed to sort of cooperate and collaborate in the right way to make that happen.
Then we're talking about collaboration.
Because like, you know, healthcare is regulated, financial services are regulated, energy is regulated. And so I think like we're at an extraordinarily interesting time. And I mean, we're venture capitalists at heart, so we're very, you know, we're excited about this. We're, you know, we feel there's an enormous amount of opportunity and optimism, I think, globally for what could come. But I think we've got to have the right alignment of incentives and to make that happen.
Right alignment of incentives. But you want to say something before you, please?
I just want to build on Tony's comment. This point, and also Dan, this point of collaboration is essential, because let's face it, nobody knows exactly how things will look like, not 5 years from now, 12 months from now.
Of course.
That's the reality. So how can a regulator really be effective when, you know, you're facing dark is a question. Now, companies, historically, tech companies, when I was running Vodafone, they were honestly very engaged in collaboration with governments and so on, because the speed was slower, because we liked it and so on. Now there is, and this is a bit of criticism that I make to the large tech companies, there's a little bit the attitude of saying, we do it because we can do it, and forget about your regulation, which is wrong, because it could lead to unintended consequences that could be bad politically, and we know that if they are bad politically, either on employment or on something, they will generate a backlash of some kind. We don't know which one, but it will. Now, health. Health to me is a wonderful example. There was a meeting in Paris last week. Health was discussed. I work for a digital health company in the portfolio of General Atlantic. The debate whether this should be public or private space is a little, in Europe in particular, is a little bit of a fake debate in my view, because it will be both, and it has to be both, because you cannot think that governments can really do all the amazing things that are going to happen in health, which will benefit the citizens, but you cannot also think that governments will allow completely private companies to completely own the data of their citizens for the foreseeable future. So a debate is needed. And a debate based on honesty and based on, of course, self-interest, because everybody has a self-interest, but based on the concept that if you have healthy societies, then the opportunities for the entrepreneurs will be better than if you have this erratic thing with conflict and then resolution, then change. So personally, but also institutionally, as for the company I work now for, we really encourage this engagement. And that's why we encourage all of our companies to really engage on these frontier discussions and try to shape them. And I have to say, large companies, they are a bit too arrogant in these days, and small ones are worried that their voice cannot be heard.
If you can give us a practical example of that debate, because I think we're talking, you know, without the practical example, and I think it's important because we're talking sovereignty here from the
predictive health, very simple, predictive health.
Go ahead.
So I have all the data, sorry, one company has all the data, Dr. Lieb has all the data about myself and can do health prevention, advise what type of, you know, probability of
Yeah.
my having certain diseases and what to do and how to do it. And of course, there is a whole chain of economic consequences of it. Now, when I was in government, we designed a data policy, especially for health. Health is 30% of the global amount of data in the world. We designed a policy which was aimed at saying, as government, we want certain safeguards on where the data is resident, how you treat it, blah, blah, blah. But you can do it as a private company if you want. And because, now, of course, also the state wants to do it for their own competencies wherever there is a public health systems, in the UK, in Italy, whatever, in France. But you need to define the rules together in order to not make innovation impossible and really give the benefit to the patients or to the citizens, but at the same time safeguard the integrity of the system. Health is the quintessential.
Thank you. Yes.
Yes, I would add this, that what we're seeing is a trend, but probably nobody is so, I don't know if everybody realizes, which is going not to data sovereignty, but data nationalism. Data is another national strategic reserve these days, because all the business are relying on data, which is a clear asset. So when you're placing a data center outside your country, you are not placing infrastructure. You're placing your citizens' health data in another country. You're placing your company's IP in a different country. And all these geopolitical implications must be taken into account when we make decisions about where do we place data centers in like-minded countries or not like-minded countries, and what are the geopolitical implications on that. So I think that is what is changing the nature of the businesses, because in this interconnected world, even though we tend to have, again, our resources closer to our geographies, and it's probably the end of multilateralism and the end of the globalization and the world is flat, as Tom Friedman put it, the reality is this is not empowerment if we do not guarantee data flows with trust. And we need to build infrastructure. I think blockchain can be a solution. And how can we exchange data among one country and another, but with trust? Because that is a critical factor. And at the same time, just to point out, even though technology companies are more powerful than ever, I think they are very dependent on national governments than ever. So you can control the chips and you can control the data centers, but you depend on national grids and national investment on energy distribution. And I think that generates not a battle between who is more powerful, is what is the new governance models we need to establish, what is the new social contract between governments and private companies. So we are not competing, we are not colliding in terms of private interest and public interest, but we're collaborating for social good and for developing I would say, huge opportunities of AI for the good of humanity. I think the opportunity is immense, and it cannot just be concentrated in very few hands in the global north. We have the great opportunity to create new entrepreneurial ecosystems in the global south, in other countries with other cultures. Remind that everything we know about AI has only been trained by data from the global north and computing power from the global north. Out of 110 supercomputers in the world, there is no single one in the global south. There is no representative data with other cultures, other religions, other cultural legacies. And I think that's a huge opportunity. We saw it yesterday in the Peter Diamandis panel. There's a huge opportunity for new players, and I think that's what we should aim for.
I was going to ask you exactly the global south, what your interaction has been in the role that you're right now playing, in the past year, for example.
There's a lack of inclusion. I mean, there's a global deficit in three aspects: lack of inclusion, lack of misrepresented data that leads to unrepresented opportunities. So we want equality in the opportunities. We need to guarantee equality in the access. That means access to data, to talent, and compute. And for example, we are proposing a global fund for artificial intelligence, not only to develop these new ecosystems in the global south or for entrepreneurs, but also how can we use AI for sustainable development goals. But there's also a lack of transparency, and that's what generates lack of trust. And we need to ask transparency, because this has been a technology that has been developed in the R&D centers of private companies, not in the academia, because they were owning the data, and they are not obliged to publish. We see that more and more, and their companies certainly are much more transparent, but that's what we need, transparency mechanisms to build trust, and I think that's what we are aiming for.
Trust seems to be the key
Sorry,
word here. Go ahead, please.
Another area where it's incredibly important, this cooperation, is for smart mobility. Smart mobility, data for mobility have implications for private businesses, for public authorities, for public transport, for road building, so again, the sharing of this information is very important. And I have to say, for example, in my experience, here was not the public, the difficult part was the private, because some of the private players did not want to share the data because it was, you know, an advantage to their business. And again, their business remains small because of that. It could become much bigger if instead there is this openness. So there's plenty of areas where this could really happen.
Interesting. Tony, I was going to ask you about examples, interesting examples of how much, you know, startups are thinking, you know, oh, I might, you know, end up selling my business to these big companies, and maybe that's what I'm looking forward to. That necessarily wasn't the case years ago, but maybe it is. So tell me about, you know, there's not a ceiling in terms of, you know, that competition that we were talking about when you're, you know, talking about investing in new ventures.
Well, look, we have such a long-term horizon that, you know, we're not investing in a young company to sort of, you know, assume that we're going to sell it, you know, relatively quickly to a large tech company. I do think the conditions for M&A and for large industries and large players in industries to sort of use M&A and acquisitions to take a leadership role in technology are much better under this administration than they have been. So I do think we feel like there'll be an opening, a little more openness around that. I think if you look back, all the big companies that we're talking about today, you know, have used acquisitions. Many of their best products and services have been acquired, some of them from our portfolio. So I think it's a healthy sort of opportunity. And I think it, you know, at the end of the day, it comes back to what the founders and the team's ambitions are, what the realities are of the market that are going to kind of influence whether that happens or not. But I do think that, you know, whether it's in healthcare where, you know, pharma and large healthcare companies have looked to the startup world to sort of, you know, acquire technologies and products and scaled innovation, or, you know, other large industries or the technology companies, it's kind of a core part of the ecosystem. It's certainly important for both the capital markets, you know, investors like ourselves, and also for the global economy. And we're more constructively optimistic that the conditions for that will be much more open and constructive today than they were over the last couple of years. But, you know, we have such a long-term horizon that, you know, we're really focused ultimately on, you know, building big standalone independent companies and looking out 5, 10, 15 years.
Lovely. We're out of time. Can't believe it. We could go on and on and on. So I hope you found this session interesting, and I'm really grateful for your ideas. Thank you so much. Thank you.